Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Woolhouse. As you know, I'm always seeking for what's behind that, what's behind that, what's behind that. I'm always trying to peel the onion, get to the center of things. And it's not easy because there's just a lot of information, but there's also a lot of misinformation. And so joining us today is a guest that's new to me. His name is Matt Ehret, and he's someone that I heard on a recent Mel K episode. And as I'm listening to this guy, I'm thinking, this guy's extremely, extremely intelligent and well-researched. And he's not just like that in one particular area. It seemed like world history, geopolitics, like the whole nine yards. And so anyway, I'm bringing him on the show just to ask him some of the big picture questions that I'm always trying to find out, like who's actually running the world? Who are we up against? Can we win? Where's this trace back into? How do these 13 bloodlines fit into this? What's really behind the Great Reset? So we're just going to be getting into a very deep conversation. This is going to be much more of a, perhaps you say, an intellectual exercise. So I hope that you're ready to approach the show and just think, okay, maybe get a notebook out, take some notes, because this guy is just a fountain of information. And so just get ready to have some fun and expand your thinking. Matt, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be joining you today.
So I had seen you through Mel K's channel, and I had seen she did a bunch of interviews with you, and I just didn't click and didn't click on one of them until recently. And it was an interview talking about the history of the Middle East and the Holy Land. And I was just so blown away, not just by your knowledge. You're like a walking encyclopedia. I think Mel calls you what, the professor? Is that what Mel has nicknamed you?
She affectionately calls me that, yeah.
So, but also your ability to go to that 100,000 foot view. And, you know, the people that watch this show, they know that's usually how I try to approach situations. Is I don't get caught up in the left versus right, or this politician, or even, you know, nation state versus nation state. I'm really trying to look at the bigger picture of, you know, what are they distracting us from? What's the real motive? How does this tie into things like silent weapons for quiet wars, as an example, which I think lays out so much of what we see happening. But I'm really trying to rise above the multiple levels of controlled A versus B, right? The Edward Bernays kind of given two choices. I'm trying to rise above that and figure out like really what's happening at the core, especially with world events. And you had the ability to do that in a way that I haven't heard in quite some time. And so anyway, I got a hold of Rob and said, Rob, you gotta help us get Matt on the show. And well, here you are.
Oh, that's cool, man. Yeah, no, I'm glad some of those ideas resonated. And yeah, most of what I find myself trying to do more and more these days is try to assist people to get above, as you just said, a lot of the controlled narratives that we are expected to fall in line to. There's all of these controlled oppositions, controlled polarizations, and you alluded to this whole technique of dividing people between left versus right dichotomizations for a very long time. It's an old strategy and technique of all empires, Babylonian, Persian, Asian, Western European, Roman, you name it. All empires have utilized this certain art of social manipulation, utilizing a certain knowledge that human beings are creatures of emotions and logic at the same time. Like we have these two attributes of our feelings and our ideas, which one is more raw, not something you could necessarily define in a computer model. You know, I can't plug in my feeling of justice or injustice into a computer model. The computer model works more on the logic. You know, I could put in some rules based on some assumptions, build in some logical consequences that are, you know, that flow from A to B to C in a very binary way. And that's useful. It's a useful thing to do. But it by itself doesn't really differentiate us from computers themselves. We're human beings, we could be trained to think like computers, and then it becomes very difficult to try to think like maybe why will computers not necessarily erase us in some evolutionary, you know, next phase of evolution where we won't exist anymore unless we merge with them, says certain neural
social media
promoters.
magnets.
Yeah, yeah. So all that to say, like if you look at the French Revolution, one of the ways it was because part of my research in history was trying to figure out why were things not worse than they were and also not better than they were. Things have unfolded in a certain way, and if you look at certain pregnant moments, they could have gone really bad, but didn't, and at different moments they could have gotten much better, but they didn't. The American Revolution is a big watershed moment, obviously, in world history, as far as a society organizing itself around a concept that would reject hereditary institutions, that would be the source before the revolution. The only source for liberty came from the hereditary lords, that would give the peasants liberty or take them away as they so chose. And that was a rejection. There was a different idea that no government should be based upon the idea that we're all sovereign. We don't just have one sovereign, but we all have a reason, a conscience, that have to mature together, and we need that liberty to be able to make mistakes, right? To express ourselves and develop our judgment, our wisdom, and thus you could have a democratic republic that could endure if you have that type of cultural excellence. But then that was a major watershed miracle that was brilliant. But then why did it fail in France? Right, you had everything going for it. Benjamin Franklin's collaborators. He had worked for decades to organize a network of trustworthy leaders across France after the success of the American Revolution, who would go back and replicate the success on in the old world. And it failed. After a few months, this thing started going sour fast, and starting in 1789. And before you knew it, all of these key figures who played such a big role to make the American Revolution a success, France played a big role. Marquis de Lafayette was in a dungeon prison for 5 years in a Habsburg prison in Austria, and Lavoisier and Jean-Sylvain Bailly, these great scientist statesmen who were organizing the first opening moments of the French Revolution, ended up getting their heads cut off, with thousands and thousands of other people, some good, some bad, some really good, all getting their heads cut off as something happened that turned it into a Jacobin bloodbath of mob rule. Basically the revolution's banner became "The revolution doesn't need scientists." So all scientists were dubbed all elitists, because they were thinking in a highbrow way, which separated them from the pure masses. And so from there, you had a vacuum of leadership, and you had a vacillation between the raw Jacobin movement, who were more feeling based, that would rabble rouse the feelings of the masses, and at different times, the Girondins would arise with a Girondin party representing the logic, who wanted to reform the whole calendar to a 10-day decimal system, and get rid of ideas of religion and God, and kind of a proto communistic reform. And both sides kind of converged on the same thing. And ultimately, both sides took turns killing each other for 5 years of civil war, at which point everybody was dead who had any qualifications, leaving, resulting in a vacuum that had to be filled. Nature abhors a vacuum, by a Napoleonic, a Napoleon, who would be funded by the Rothschilds, by the City of London bankers, and would very quickly say that, oh yeah, I promised you guys I was going to be a consul reviving the Roman Republic. Actually, my model's the Roman Empire. I'm going to be the Roman Emperor. Sorry. And that was just 20 years of hell on earth across all of Europe in never-ending wars, which really soured people's minds who were otherwise sympathetic to the idea of a republic. After 20 years of trauma of Napoleonic wars in Europe, all of these people were either turned against the revolution, the idea of republicanism. They became just so desirous of some stability and security in their lives, that they were like, just give us back some secure monarchies. That's all we want. So you had the restoration of the monarchies as the great solution under Castlereagh and Metternich in 1815. And with that came the Carlsbad decrees, which culturally banned all literature which would be declared dangerous to stability and stasis. And this is what Henry Kissinger. So the artists, the poets, the Shelleys, the Mozarts, you couldn't listen to any type of art or poetry or literary. Thomas Paine was banned as being insurrectionary. That's what leads us to never-ending wars if we let those types of creative ideas in. So you need to have censors controlling all of the schools, the presses, and America benefited because that was where all of a sudden a lot of the freedom-loving Germans were like, well, I'm being crushed, and my colleagues are being killed. The better Freemasonic lodges that were still working with Mozart and his allies were all purged. That was gone in Europe. Any type of like moral lodges at that point, I think that they were completely annihilated by 1815. Coming out of that with the restoration of the oligarchies in this, and so the better Germans came to America, the better Europeans came to America to get some sanctuary, and that was able to be that was very useful for a young republic trying to figure out how to develop skill sets, build infrastructure, learn science. So the German spirit was we got the best of it, thankfully. And I say we, I'm Canadian, but I the big we. And last thing I'll just note is that Henry Kissinger, just as he was being brought into the Bilderberger Group in the 1950s, he had already been a student under William Yandell Elliott, the Rhodes Scholar controller of who ran the Chatham House of Harvard operation in the USA. For those who don't know, Rhodes Scholars brainwashed in Oxford, sent back to various parts of the world to carry out essentially a one world government, to restore the grandeur of the British Empire, which was the one world government, but undermine things like the American Revolution, any type of desirous nation state wanting to use their sovereignty, that has to be undermined. So that's the way the Rhodes Scholarship system has kind of worked over the past century. And Kissinger's mentor was one of these high level operatives who trained, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, trained under William Yandell Elliott, Samuel P. Huntington. So Kissinger writes that his first thesis that he writes that becomes sort of his entry into the higher clubs is his assessment of the Congress of Vienna of 1815, which he points out is the high point of human civilization, which we should aspire to organize the current drive for a new world order in the 1950s. When he's writing this, is the role model of the Congress of Vienna. So a lot of people don't realize the meaning of the weight of what that means, because that defines everything he does for the next 70 years of his overly productive evil life. And really it's this idea, and he goes through it, of what Kesselre, Metternich, the oligarchical high command, they were able to create a system of maximum stasis, no change, maximum control, at least for a period, of an elite class of masters who would lord over a bigger class of slave families within a system of relative agreement to keep global populations and thoughts in a cage. So that's the sort of revamping that he was carrying out under people like David Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, who brought him into the Rockefeller Commission of 1956 that ran the Rockefeller Report, which is still classified, but we've got certain sanitized public executive summaries that have been released, basically going through how will America be converted into or play a role in the New World Order. Which again, Nelson Rockefeller, David, Henry Luce of Time Magazine, the big fascist, they're all part of this committee. Lawrence Rockefeller is a key guy, and Kissinger, that's one of his first gigs. And this is the thing, we're always played left versus right? The Jacobins versus Girondins, the logic part. So create a movement centered around cold logic and principles, but devoid of real heart, and then create an opposing counter movement of people who are all heart, all feeling, but deny any idea of logic, that reason is tyranny, and that we just have to be raw, pure, noble savages to be authentic. And you can just always play people against each other with these techniques of the human condition. So that's I think with that, one is able to better get into what is behind the Middle East, all of the problems of the Middle East, going back to the 1890s even, when the British started putting online, British high command, a lot of hardcore anti-Semitic fascists like Lord Balfour, who despised the Jews, were all putting into motion a project to try to convince the world Jews to all go and live in the desert in a very controlled, volatile zone. So you're like Lord Balfour, Lloyd George, Lord Chamberlain, Lord Milner, the controller of the Round Table, a co-author of the Balfour Accords. They're all anti-Semites who despise the Jews. They want the world purged of Jews, except for like good Jews who are more adaptive to the type of oligarchical cultural modes that they want to work or create. And they work with certain people like Walter Rothschild, who's a useful moneybags but never lives in Israel. Never. He bought land there to try to help other Jews that, on the lower rungs go there, but he never lived there. No Rothschild ever lived in Israel. It was never, because it was never supposed to be something that was going to be a stable area. It was this, you're going to go into a region and then, create a geopolitical zone of chaos around which the major civilizational states of the world, Asia, Africa, Russia, Eurasia, Central Asia, Europe, all intersect in this little convenient zone off the Mediterranean. It's like it's a geopolitical pivot from the standpoint of geopolitics. That's how they see it. So any ideology you can cultivate that will maximize chaos in that zone will ensure a better divide to conquer strategy, so that no danger of civilizational states working together in opposition to an imperial force will ever occur. And that's, I think, how I tend to try to look at it and map out what is behind a lot of the fires from the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War, the killing of leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat, who had an alliance in the 90s, both of whom were murdered, and what was destroyed, what was undermined, what went sour that could have been good, and what's behind today's situation.
Folks, I have a quick message for you. 2024 is do or die for the globalists and communists that want to absolutely destroy America. And one of the number one things they're going to be targeting is our financial system, whether it's through bank collapses or a financial collapse or the market collapsing, whatever it is, they will try to do anything possible to force us into their central bank digital currency, because that's what gives them absolute and total control. And so if you have money sitting in a bank account, savings, 401k, stock market, etc., those are all vulnerable to these attacks. This is why I'm such a big believer in precious metals, because they are an insurance policies against this global agenda to destroy America. And so, folks, even if you move just a small portion of your assets into precious metals, you know that in case things go really bad, which I hope they don't, but unfortunately, I think that all the signs are pointing towards that happening, you have some aspect of your wealth that you can preserve through the chaos, protect your family. And so if you need someone that you can trust, that I personally trust extremely, extremely so much, it's Dr. Kirk Elliott. He's a good friend of mine, and he's someone that will give you a fair price on precious metals, physical silver and gold. So today, go to goldwithseth.com. Again, that's goldwithseth.com, or call 720-605-3900 to speak to someone on Kirk's team that will get you in their queue right away. They'll set up a free consultation with one of his wealth advisors. Again, folks, I don't want to be a fear monger, but I genuinely believe they're going to be doing everything possible to collapse this system so they can control us. And physical gold and physical silvers are one of the best insurance policies to make sure that your family is protected against the Great Reset. There's so much to unpack there. But
yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. I'm loving it. It's like there's this tube of information that's kind of streaming into my head, and it's fantastic. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, because I have a question that's really the ultimate bigger picture, right? Because as people journey down the truth of the path of waking up, whether it was 9/11 or whether it was COVID or the 2016 election or whatever it is that shook people, and they said, wait, my government's trying to kill us. They control the media's lying, and they get into they start researching, okay, who is it? And everyone says, oh, it's Klaus Schwab, it's the WEF, it's the bloodlines, it's the Chinese, it's this, and it's the European banking cartel, it's the Rothschilds, there's all these different paths that, and I know it's not a crystal clear picture. I know it's not some hierarchical pyramid that's very organized and there's infighting and everything. But when we look around and you see the coordination of things like the pandemic as an example and the vaccine rollout, that was very, very centrally organized, and not just by the corporatocracy or the alphabet agencies or DARPA or IARPA or what any of these other agencies. It went much deeper, it seemed. And so when you look at the world's stage today, and you see things like BRICS and China and Russia, and then them opposing the West, and you have these points like Ukraine, where you have Biden and our captured politicians here sending all this money to Ukraine, yet a lot of them are also controlled by China, which is also funding and backing up Russia in the Ukraine. And then you have, we'll get in the Middle East, but And then you have Soros coming out and saying that Xi Jinping is one of the greatest threats to open societies in the world. Then you have state-run Chinese media saying that Soros is a son of Satan. Yet the WEF is also working with Xi Jinping, and you've also got these WEF events happening in Russia with the young communists. And like as you piece this together, it just gets so messy. And some people are very quick to say, "Oh, look, Putin is trying to destroy the deep state. He's trying to free us from this, and maybe he's teaming up with Xi, and maybe Trump's involved." And you have all these different messy narratives, and I'm just trying to make sense of it all. And a lot of my guests are having these conversations, but in your
Yeah.
mind and through your research, does it get to some sort of very, very small group of a handful of individuals that are actually orchestrating almost everything that we see around the world?
Yeah, kinda. In my analysis, yeah, I do sort of see this hierarchically managed, but not exactly. And I agree with you that there's not necessarily um, a coherence or a consensus in how this is going to unfold amongst the ruling. And I do see this as ultimately animated not by any ethnic group. And I caution anybody listening who have fallen into a place where they find themselves concluding that the source or causality of evil now and deep into our past can be rooted in something ethnic or genetic. If you're going down that path, I caution people to pull back and revisit their assumptions a little bit. I'm looking at this from the standpoint of epistemology, the logic of how ideas of or how knowledge emerges, both true knowledge and its counterfeit. Because you could make the true appear false, and you can make the false appear true using a mixture or a misuse of those things I mentioned regarding the rules of logic tied to emotions. There's a good use of both that should dance together in a mature human being. And then there's the misuse of either one that could also be used to create. We see this with this effect with sophistry, right? The emergence of sophistry in ancient Greece, how the demos was able to be converted into its own worst enemy through flowery language and the arts of rhetoricians that were targeted by truth lovers like Socrates and his student Plato and the Platonic Academy. They're trying to help people understand how are they being duped into thinking their self-destruction is their salvation, such that Athens was able to be, through the support of the people, it was the Democratic Party that voted to kill Socrates through drinking hemlock, right, as being a corrupter of the youth and somebody who is undermining the faith in the pantheon of gods that were, the center around which the priesthood at Delphi, the cult of Apollo at Delphi, the various core cults that organized intelligence, monetary proto-banking systems, managed the geopolitical operations of wars, because any general or king of ancient Athens or Persia or Sparta, or to know who do I make an alliance with, who do I go to war with, they would go to the oracle. They had that was what was expected of them, and pay a lot of money. So the oracle had the oracles of Delphi, the cult of Eleusis, had a ton of capital to then lend to. They also had a ton of intelligence because enemies would come to them, right, paying cash to see what do I do. So now you're the priesthood who's interpreting what the doped up oracle is saying. Usually some poor girl who's selected, often raped by the priesthood, doped up on psychedelics, which they were using proto psychedelics, derivatives of wheat blight that they later on turned into LSD in our 20th century. This is something that was used back then too as part of the rites of initiation. But they would have these oracles doped up, blathering randomness out there into the whatever, and then the priest would then interpret what Apollo, who's actually a proto, before there was Christianity. Apollo was a proto Lucifer, the god of light, the god of the sun, also the god of destruction, who had a dark side. And who do you go to war with? So they had all sides. It controlled these networks controlled an international array of intelligence. This was intelligence, globally extended. So why am I saying all of this right now? The the thing is, it was the demo. It was sophistry, is rhetoric that was transforming people into their own destruction. And I think, from my standpoint, I'm looking at, well, where did the good emerge in every civilization? When I look at world history, I try to study history. I try to take as much of it step back as possible to look, where did authentic goodness tend to emerge, and where did its subversion emerge in my study of Chinese history or Indian history, Egyptian history, Western European history, you name it. There's you could always find something universal about goodness and courage and freedom lovingness, which will tend to emerge and create measurable good things, increased Renaissance moments where all of a sudden you can find population growth skyrocketing, quality of life skyrocketing, usually accompanied with blossoming architecture, artistic, scientific revolutions. Usually these processes accompany an orientation towards peacemaking. War avoidance is the sort of thing you tend to find when these things emerge. And whenever the goodness is subverted, sometimes from outside forces, oftentimes from inside forces, there's usually a common way that happens, and that dark age processes start taking hold, and cultures start forgetting what they once knew, or what they took for granted, as they fall into corruption, decay, decadence, looking at your neighbor as something to either be afraid of or to steal from, instead of somebody to work with as a brother, even though they might have a different skin color or something. So and then you get wars, divide to conquer processes, and you'll usually find a wealth transfer into an oligarchical class or caste, whenever these types of things occur, that enjoys getting the slaves to fight. So in my view, there is a material component to the oligarchy that does tie into primarily the old families of Europe. Like, I'm talking here, like the old nobilities. Some of them are monarchs. Other ones just happen to be part of the lords and various noble families of Italy, especially some of whom can go back and trace their lineage back to like Emperor Julian, like the Orsini family, or Emperor Claudius. Many doges, many leading members of the Roman Senate of the Roman Empire are still have direct continuity of leading families who are inheritors of what are called family fondies, the family trusts that sort of are what keep and maintain multi-generational traditions amongst these governing classes, which is unfortunate, because I think a lot of these children are highly abused and groomed to become broken of something human in order for them to become managers of the system that they were born into. It's kind of a sick thing. So I do see it that way, and they've developed certain necessary arts of infiltration and perversion of anything, whether it's the Christian matrix, the Muslim, the Jewish, anything that's an institution, religious or political. They will. They have certain techniques that I've already been alluding to that will be applied to turn it into its opposite, or bring out the worst elements of anything to destroy it from within, or at least use it for a period before destroying it for its benefit.
Hey folks, I have a quick message for you. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this interview. I have one small request. If you're enjoying what you're listening to, could you please share this interview with one person, just one person? Because of censorship and shadow banning, it's so hard to get this content out to more people. And the only way we can really do it is when you help by sharing it. So if you like what you're listening to, hit pause, share it with one person. It helps so much. Thank you so much.
And how many wars have been done in the name of Christ, right? The Crusades, where countless thousands were of innocents were murdered. Jews, Muslims, and Christian alike were all killed in never-ending wars for centuries for these crusades in the name of Christ. It didn't need to happen. It was done for geopolitical reasons, and if you were trying to find a purely religious reason for the crusades, you couldn't. You'd be limited. It wouldn't get you there. You'd have to look at who were the geopolitical leading cultists that created the Templars, that was so important for managing and shaping the crusades, which involves people like the Cistercian monk, or actually a guy who put like two popes into office, Bernard de Clairvaux, who was a leading ultramontanist who believed in effectively controlling the world under the form of a new Roman Empire or emperor, that would have both the control of the whole, and he saw that as the Pope. The papacy was the controller of the world in his mind, and whoever controls the papacy, the Pope, controls the world, which is where him and his little coterie of cultists, who, in my research, it seems like he's actually a follower, an inductee with his family. It's a high level oligarchical mercenary family that gave rise to this guy who created the Templars. He created the charter of what became the Templar Holy Knights that would then facilitate the Second and Third Crusade, as well as global banking. But he himself was part of the cult of Mithra. And even today, you have all of these like Mithraic cults, thousands of them in Egypt, in the Holy Land, in Europe, in England, often in caves. They sacrificed in caves, and it was the core cult of the Roman Praetorian Guard and the Roman legions. That was the cult that was brought in from Anatolia back in, even before Rome became an empire. It was brought in, but it became, to be anybody with influence within the Roman military, you had to be an inductee through the 8 degrees of the cult of Mithra, which continued even after Christianity. It basically was rebranded a little bit to give it a bit of a Christian veneer, but there was always sort of secret Gnostic discoveries you would make along the way of the rites of initiation as you move up the chain. And so, you have to go there, because the whole thing was it wasn't like evil for its own sake. It was evil to destroy a greater good. Because if you look at what was going on before the Crusades, there was this, like I was mentioning, look for goodness, right? Wherever, in whatever cultural matrix you find, you can find goodness that has a common character of sacrifice, loving your neighbor, loving your concept of a loving, reasonable creator, instead of seeing the creator as being an irrational tyrant or something, but rather seeing the creator as a loving, living, reasonable creator. There's a concept that in India's history, in China's history, and obviously the Christian history. It's all over St. Augustine's work, and it's in Plato's works. So there was a beautiful process. And Melky and I, we just did a third show in this series going through this Jewish, Islamic, Christian, Chinese alliance of the 8th, 9th centuries, which saw Renaissance movements, measurable Renaissance movements of cathedral building, training of orphans to read, houses of wisdom in Baghdad, in Charlemagne's Europe, as well as in the revival of the Silk Road, which was being revived through the Tang Dynasty, that had a special, beautiful relationship as a point of bringing East-West trade, but also stories, poetry across these cultures through the Middle East, all the way into Europe, into Africa. And this had to come undone. And so there was so much effort to get what Samuel P. Huntington with Kissinger later on brought into being with Zbigniew in the 70s, this new clash of civilizations, get people to only see their neighbors as the other, that you have to be sort of you have to feel some sense of animosity towards the other. So you had Christians, again, like massacring Jews in the Rhineland during the Crusades. You had Christians killing Muslims. You had Muslims killing Christians. And all of this was being influenced by the same bankers who at this time went from Rome as their center of command. By this point, it was more Venice that became the center of command of the old families, the Fondis. But they had branches all the way through the various dynastic families, the Norman families, the Norman chivalry that were funded to take over Britain and purge Britain in the 11th century of their patriots. That Norman chivalry was a pagan class of sort of Vikings who worshipped rune myths, had a whole idea of child sacrifice, but that would masquerade under a slight Christian veneer. And this is what the Nazis were later created as a new synthetic cult by the same financiers who sort of like would migrate from one geographical location at different moments to another one. But they would maintain the same bloodlines. They would use the same techniques, slightly, obviously adapted to the times. And what were the Nazis? It was a black magic occult secret society under the Ariosophists and the Thule Society, which were doing sacrifices. They had a whole new Templar order around Hermann Goering and the Wewelsburg Castle, with the black sun of the occult being their core symbol, which was and they were all looking at like runes, reviving these Nordic Viking myths that they saw as pure pre-Christian goodness that they had to revive. So the whole thing was a revival of these pagan occult behavioral patterns, which is what the oligarchy has been trying to do, is just undermine. That's simply what they want to do. They want to bring back feudalism, undermine any type of faith in a monotheistic, reasonable, loving creator that tends to find expression very clearly in the Christian matrix, but also you find it in every Abrahamic faith. There are movements that see God not as a tyrant, but as a reasonable, loving God who we should act in that image. And every time we do that, things go pretty well for humans and go worse for the oligarchy. So that's how I look at today's situation today. I try to carry a lot of these lessons that I've dug up in my mind, and I try to keep them in my back pocket, and I try to look at, well, there's so much. There's no simple answer, because there's no such thing as a sovereign nation state in the sort of popular way of a crystallized sovereign nation state making its own decisions. No, there's an international oligarchy with penetrations to varying degrees in every part of the world, and in some parts of the world we see configurations of statesmen who are trying to push back against it, and then in other places we see it having become more successful, as in the United States, at taking over the dead bodies of John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. It's much more ingrained in some ways, despite, I think, the authentic efforts being made by the non-neocon Republican movement, which I see as the only hope in the United States to survive, is through the non-neocon Republican movement, and maybe some Democrats who are able to realize how they've been duped, who could maybe get some convergence. Without that, I don't see any hope for the U.S. or Canada. But the last thing on that point is Russia, China, India, everybody has been penetrated over many generations by what I define as being like the same cultic cult religions of the ancient times still exist, as I pointed out, both with watered down versions for the masses, but also slightly more condensed versions for those managers and managers of the managers. So you've got like different tranches of doctrine, but are effectively cultic, cultish, and they still exist, though they currently have more of a pseudoscientific veneer that's been caked in and really worked on over the last 100 years or so, especially. And we've seen it with the Rockefeller. What type of science did the Rockefeller Foundation start funding over a century ago, with the Carnegie Foundation, with the Josiah Macy Foundation? These various foundations run often by Eastern establishment bloodline families tied to the Cabots, the Lodges, the Lowells, these different groups that were founders of the Pilgrim Society, right? When McKinley was assassinated, you had the Pilgrim Society in 1902, set up by these Eastern establishment, what they call the Boston Brahmins, these these families that saw themselves as the untouchable, or not untouchable, the pure Brahmins of the higher caste, and they created the Pilgrim Society to encourage exactly what it says. And Kissinger is a leading figure in the Pilgrim Society even today, which is created an Anglo-American special relationship to consolidate world affairs under this Anglo-American divine heritage or whatever, to co-manage the world. That was anti-American, always was, treacherous, and it could only occur over the dead body of a McKinley, who had to be killed to make that thing happen. But these creatures started funding through their foundations as philanthropic cover groups certain sciences that would be favorable to shaping a more pliable society for the masses, but also a managerial elite in the professional class, the technocrats who would be assigned a role, even without them fully understanding it, that would be managers of something anti-human. And we saw in the medical sciences that were funded, the genetic sciences, eugenics got its rise entirely by these money bags. A lot of things, even the quantum mechanics. If you look at it, even the growth of the derailment of the type of discoveries that were being made by real scientists like Max Planck and Einstein and Madame Curie and these great scientists who are making real discoveries into the nature of the universe and translating that into new technologies and ways for us to live better and more in harmony with God's creation. That whole generation of scientists became the obsolete old guard, with the new generation of mathematicians and statistical probability theorists who received all of this money through the Copenhagen School, but then that spread out as a new standard to say, oh no, there's no truth. Because at the bottom, at the heart of all matter and apparent order and harmony that we see with our senses is actually atoms made up of nothing, composed by randomness. And so they baked in these lobotomized assumptions about chaos being core and causal to everything in the world. And you see why that somebody like a an oligarchical social engineer would want us to think that we think we're made of reality, but in fact we're just made up of a bunch of nothings. These atoms of randomness, mostly 99.9% of nothingness, makes us all up. So there's really no. This becomes like an easy hypnotic tool to get people into a spell where they can become led to believe that nothing really exists except for, and then whatever, you create your own narrative. So this is the sort of thing that corrupted a new generation of elite scientists in the medical world, in the hard scientific world. It really got bad under the Manhattan Project that was shaped by British intelligence. And I'm going to actually have a documentary coming out on that. And the creation of new standards and norms that we all had to adapt our minds to if we wanted to be a respected climatologist. You had to accept certain assumptions. And so the field that was generated as a new science of all sciences out of World War II, it was known as cybernetics, the science of controls.
Folks, I have a quick message for you. Look, the 2024 election is do or die for the globalists and communists that have infiltrated our country and are currently running it. And they either have to win or they're going to destroy America so nothing is left either way. And if you're the person that's watching this show and following this information, unfortunately, you have the weight on your shoulders of making sure that your family is prepared, especially as we head into this next year and this next election cycle, because unfortunately, I think it's going to get rough. And one of the ways I know they're going to target us is through our food supply. You can see all the food factories burned down. You can see the warnings of coming famines and food shortages and everything like that. And food is one of the number one ways totalitarian regimes have always used to control the population, is destroy the food supply. So if you don't have at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of stored food, I highly recommend you take that very seriously. Because look, as I mentioned, if you're the person that's watching this, you're the person that carries the burden of making sure your family is prepared. I would recommend at least 6 months, if not a year, of storable food. So if things go haywire, whether it's grid down or terrorist attack from what's coming across the border, that your family can safely stay in place and you can feed your family. So folks, today, go to heavensharvest.com and make sure you get your storable food that'll last for up to 25 years. Just in case things go south, you know that you have what's going to take to feed your family, which is so, so critical for us to get through this next stage of history. So go to heavensharvest.com today, order your food that'll last up to 25 years, and use promo code Seth to save 15% on your entire order. Again, that's heavensharvest.com and use promo code Seth, S-E-T-H, to save 15% on your entire order.
And Norbert Wiener, who was a student of Bertrand Russell, a high-level depopulationist oligarch who groomed a whole network of young, brilliant psychopaths out of Cambridge in 1913 when he was teaching there, writing the Principia Mathematica. One of them was Norbert Wiener, but there were others. John von Neumann was another, but they applied what Russell had called for the creation of with his Principia as a closed system of mathematization of the entire universe, bounded by a limited set of axioms. Right, you could have a limited set of axioms of basic blind assumptions that are rules that we have to assume the entire universe can be deducted into. All observations that are observable can all be plugged into a model that has these limits. Now, that was proven to not be possible but these guys didn't care. They were committed to their project. So even though Kurt Gödel proved that you could not create any closed system, right? Because anytime you try to like define any system, there's a self-referential quality that the system can refer to itself, and at which point there's a requirement that there's something outside of the system that contains that system in which it's referring to itself that is not within the system. So he proved very eloquently in 1932 that it's not possible to do what Bertrand Russell and his devotees wanted to do, but they did it anyway. And so they developed cybernetics, the science of controls, that became sponsored by the Josiah Macy Foundation, the same thing that was sponsoring Nazi scientists and eugenics, which was run by the guy who founded the NSA, the Black Chamber. Marlborough Churchill, a cousin of Winston, was the guy running the Macy Foundation, and which is just weird unto itself, right? And this becomes the basis of the Five Eyes, the NSA that he created, that he ran for like 20 years. The Macy Foundation creates the Macy Foundation Conferences on Cybernetics. This is what creates the structure around which MK Ultra would be created. Margaret Mead, Bateson are leading figures within that process. They're looking at how do you take these new mind drugs. Aldous Huxley and his family, his clan, again, with these groomed families, right? One of their brothers committed suicide because the pressure to be an oligarch was so intense he couldn't stand it and killed himself, hung himself on a tree. Matthew Huxley, the other two did their jobs and developed the iron stomachs that they needed to. But this became what was used cybernetics to reform the new OECD. This became the basis of NATO's entire system. It became the basis of RAND Corps, as RAND Corps was created to now start a new type of scientific policy making around computer modeling. And that was created, again, overseen by the CIA, brought in to the United States to shape everything from economic policy, foreign military policy, whether we build up our nuclear warheads, how do we interpret Russia's intentions. It's all based on computer modeling, because computers are so much more superior to the fallible human minds that are contaminated with feelings. No, computers are science. So that became RAND Corps. That's what JFK tried to fight against, because if we went with the RAND Corps view of things, we would have been in a nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all of the Joint Chiefs were thinking along the lines of RAND. That's what JFK and his brother were fighting against. The same thing was brought in to Russia, even though cybernetics had been banned as a bourgeoisie corrupting science that denied human freedom. The moment Stalin was dead, it became rehabilitated. It was brought in every level of scientific practice and governing practice in Russia. Khrushchev gave a speech in 1960 saying that cybernetics is now the centerpiece around which all Soviet administration will be built. So this created and groomed a whole class of cybernetics experts who became administrators. They then groomed and so it's sort of a pagan cult, but masquerading as science. And it has a force unto itself, because the people who tend to be within, who are groomed to adopt a worldview and a cosmology and a self-identity based around a cybernetic set of assumptions, they lose something human. They become something you're very concerned with. If you're a human being with political influence who has to now deal with these networks and these nests that were there already before you attain political power, you can't just come out and say, like Alexander, or not Alexander, Akhenaten, right? Great example. Go back to history. Akhenaten was an Egyptian leader who didn't get it. He messed up. Why did he mess up? He was a good guy. All evidence shows he was a really good guy. Lived around the time a little bit before Moses. He was a monotheist. He tried to overthrow all of the pagan polytheistic deities of the Egyptian priesthood way too fast. He was like, no, this is immoral. There's one God, one Lord. He's a moral, reasonable Lord, and I'm going to assert that truth and make enemies with the entire priesthood, military class, legions of soldiers of Egypt. I'm going to build a new capital far removed so we can get away from the corruption of the old capital. And it lasted for like him and Nefertiti. They tried. The arts were beautiful in their period. You could see that there's something really special, even though there was efforts to smudge them out of history. We only discovered that Akhenaten existed like a century ago. He was wiped out of memory for over 2,500 years. But he moved too fast. He didn't know how to play the game. He couldn't, because you can't. You're dealing with people who will kill you to preserve their raison d'être. So I think that when I look at a lot, like, where do I see goodness in terms of like a resistance to the woke ideology, a defense of family structures, a defense of an idea of a morality in the universe, not just created by humans, but there in the universe around which we have to model our behavior as humans, or a push towards development, ending hunger, ending poverty, trying to find peace corridors. I see actions and policies today that fall into harmony with that what I define as goodness, right? Or things that are in harmony with at the very least a reasonable practicality, if you want to even like reduce it to that, because it's more practicable or practical to live in a world that doesn't have wars all over you and where people want to kill you. It's better to live in a world, your self-interest will be more maintained if your neighbors don't want to kill you and there's some general prosperity to be had. I do see that happening, and I do see an effort to create abundance instead of scarcity in parts of the world that are not what I'm living in my NATO Five Eyes cage part of the world. So I do see that in Eurasia, and I also see penetrations of these cybernetics cults in Russia. I see it in the scientific community, in the medical community. I see it tied to Western intelligence. I see it in China. I see it in India. I see it to a certain degree, and also in Iran. But I do see a fight there that I don't see in the same intensity here anymore. So I that's how I'm defining my nuance. My language will be used by figures with political influence in China or in Russia. But then again, like you just pointed out, China did kick out Soros. They banned him for life in 1989 and shut down his open societies. They took a World Economic Forum trustee, Jack Ma, who's sort of the Bill Gates of China, transhumanist freak, who like is the one behind a lot of the worst elements of social credit under his Alibaba, Alipay, all of these things that run like something like 1 billion people are using Alipay and Alibaba, or Alipay and that are tied to various types of social credit rating systems. They took this transhumanist Bill Gates World Economic Forum freak, and as he was calling for essentially a banking coup in China, in Beijing, it was in Shanghai in 2020. They actually did something about it. They took that guy down. They stripped him of his. They said you could teach high school. You could keep your money. You could live in your mansion, but you can't do anything except teach high school. And even then, they shut down his university. He had like a Soros University thing to train new technocrats, like what Soros did with his his new Institute for Economic Policy and his Soros University that's been created in the West. They had something like that in China. They took it down. They shut it down, fired the teachers. So I'm seeing like a fight, and I don't see a similar kind of fight being waged here so much from institutions. I see it from the people. I see it from people trying to get power, who I hope will, but I don't see it so much from but I do see a lot of narratives being created to convince us either that we can reduce all or simplify all of that complexity, ignore all the nuance, and just find it a nice, clean enemy image in the same thing that worked in the Cold War to keep us very much controlled by the oligarchy, which is, the old Kremlin, Beijing, commie boogeyman are always there, and we never dealt with that trauma. We were given that every day, the baby boomers, every single day from the 50s all the way on to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a lot of unresolved trauma that just went underground into our subconscious, and the spell makers are able to they know where to push to just bring it all back to the surface. Similar lines of stories are being created by the new Hoovers, the new Freemasonic, Southern right operatives that are running today's FBI, just like they were running back then. Christopher Wray is coming out saying, we've heard that Iran has got a plan to kill and assassinate our heads of state in America. It's like, okay, where's the evidence of that? We're patriots. We're the FBI. Why would we lie? And it's like the Cold War. I mean, you killed Martin Luther King, didn't you? I feel like so you got this whole thing, and so that's how I try to bring people to at least entertain that top-down approach to analyzing the patterns and the fight today.
Wow. So Here's my kind of simplified summary of this. So it seems like you had these power structures that existed back in Roman times, and probably even that time, were already generations and generations old, and that basically that these lineages, these bloodlines have, through secret societies and through staying hidden and through mastering the ability to cloak and to infiltrate and kind of take over organizations and in different industries, whether it's any kind of collective group thought, like a religion or an organization or a system that was, they could control and manipulate, and that so over the years they've been controlling and manipulating and maintaining their power, but also gaining control over the financial systems and using that as a way to maintain their power. And that on the opposition of that, though, there's always this kind of divine human spirit that's trying to blossom. It's trying to create beauty, to manifest God's will on earth, right? And so you have these periods throughout history where that emerged and it blossomed, and maybe that was a period where the oligarchs had less control, or they didn't control the beginning of it and it grew a little bit too big, and then they had to go in and destroy it, right? And these oligarchs have always used war as a tool to redraw boundaries, to basically to shake up any country that is getting too strong outside of their control. They've used wars, and like that's what kind of takes us to where we are today. And I feel like, gosh, we're coming up on an hour here, and I feel like we've only just started, so we'll certainly have to do more of these interviews. I guess as one kind of final question, just for you as we wrap up, and we're certainly going to be doing part 2, 3, 4, 5. There's I mean, we could talk about a lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But in conclusion for today, with where we're at now, with what people coin the Great Awakening, with the people, the commoners now understanding, in a large way, in a large group, understanding they've been manipulated, understanding they've been lied to, and understanding that also that they have power, right? We're not the peasants of 1500, where if we, storm against the king, we'll all be slaughtered and executed, and our wives and daughters will be raped and killed, right? Like now we've got tools like Rumble, and we've got Twitter, and which seems relatively open. So it's like we now have the tools to go against the narrative, to counter the information war. And so the question I'm getting to is that, do you see that we're at an inflection point in history where the people, the individuals, you and I, that we are now at a place where we can overthrow this global oligarchy?
Yes, I do see that, and I do believe that this is possible and necessary. And anything which is both possible and necessary must happen. It doesn't mean it will happen, because people don't have to do what's possible and necessary. We have free will, and that means we have the will to be stupid. However, the toleration of stupidity at this point has we've used it all up. There's no more tolerance to stupidity cards we can still play at this stage of crisis. So we got a systemic meltdown. It's been a long time coming. It didn't start in a couple of years ago. It didn't start with Obama. It didn't start with Bill Clinton. It didn't start with Reagan. This has been a process, a slow self-annihilation as far as atrophying our infrastructure, outsourcing our industry, going for myopic, momentary speculation and profit instead of thinking about what are we creating for the next generation, as far as what defines our standard of what capitalism should be as an industrial capitalism, which we used to have, but we forgot how to do it. Now we're in speculation, I'm a consumer, so I'm a good citizen type of capitalism. That was never meant to be sustainable. So now we got a bubble economy. The bubbles are popping. Okay, so the bubbles are popping. The banks are collapsing. They want to take us down with them. So looking at our history, we've been in similar, not the exact same, but similar situations with the Great Depression. We've seen this in other cases as well. There have been things that have been able to be wielded as far as the power of the national or the sovereign nation state and the power of the Constitution, especially in the United States, which has been uniquely powerful at counteracting the influence of the oligarchy's drive to kill us and and enslave us under feudalism. It's not like it's something that they've just started doing now. It's been an ongoing intention and a desire over many generations, really even the second the American Revolution was over. The intention to undermine the revolution and the republic from within was always an animating force behind every action that was taken for the bad in America's history. There's always been this fifth column built up, baked into the US through loyalists to the British Empire who acted like patriots, but always created institutions that would serve as destructive influences to undermine the sovereignty of the US and the excellence, the moral excellence of the people. In order to popularize mediocrity, popularize stupidity, popularize mob-think, in order to get us to forget how to govern ourselves, to lose the power of judgment. If people can't judge themselves, if they can't rule themselves, they can't judge the policies for their nation. They can't be a sovereign nation is based on a sovereign people, which means sovereign individuals. But that means you have to have, like John Adams said, right? The republic is made for a moral and religious people and is wholly unfit for any other. But if you have any other kind of people and culture that encourages any other kind of people than what he said, you will have mob tyranny, the tyranny of the stupid, masquerading as democracy, but it won't be real because you'll have demagogues who will always pull the people strings through arts of rhetoric and sophistry. So now we're at a point where we've forgotten how, too many people, not everybody, but many people have forgotten how America has successfully done battle with this oligarchy and has subverted previous attempts at a new world order, which came close but were subverted by patriots. We've lost a little bit of touch. So we're too many people who are good patriots, hating the Great Reset, wanting to stop it, wanting to save their families, are too ill-informed about some of the policies that they could do to let these private financiers who are sitting on a bankrupt bubble of fake assets, instead of bailing them out, instead of using the government protection to treat these oligarchs as welfare recipients for infinite bailouts, making it worse and serving their interests in wars in the Middle East. We could do things like Glass-Steagall. There's precedents, legal precedents. Break up the banks, let them take their own losses. If they're a bankrupt bank, doesn't matter how big they are, they can fail, and protect the small commercial banks. These are things that Trump had even talked about in 2017. He gave speeches on the importance of restoring Glass-Steagall, and I think some pressure from some Wall Street backers who were like, no, don't talk like that. So he pulled back. But I think that it's something that's there. The use of the American system of what McKinley was doing with the protective tariff, the state-directed credit for building industrial capital-intensive projects that create financial incentives for the individual citizen to invest in, to get actual monetary rewards in time by investing in bonds like the greenbacks or the 520 bonds or the victory bonds. There's various times where these have been used to great effect because we get individual monetary rewards, but at the same time, the nation benefits. So you have a harmonization whenever this happens of the idea of the individual liberty of the person at the same time and their personal profit, as well as tying it to the greater, the general welfare of the nation as a whole at the same time. It breaks you out of this trap of, are you an individualist, free market follower of British economists like Adam Smith, or are you an anti-individual Marxist collectivist commie? Or pick a side, right? That was our choices in the Cold War. Pick a side. It's like, wait a minute. America was not based on any of those choices. It was based on, are you a good person wanting to have a sovereign nation with sovereign people against empire, or are you an imperialist traitor? That was the choices. They're much clearer cut. And the idea of the Declaration of Independence, right, enshrining the inalienable rights of the individual with the Constitution calling for the general welfare, seems to be, for many people today, confusing because they seem to be two different opposing things. And it's like, no. The only way the nation can actually mature and endure is when the culture encourages and brings out a recognition that, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But you want to get pleasure and your sense of freedom in taking responsibility for your country, and there's a reciprocity there. And when you get that, you're good. You're generally going to be a good place, and you won't fall for these traps that imperialists always set for people. So I do think that the American people have the moral fortitude. They've got an incredible constitution that gives them an immense amount of power, which is why the oligarchy and their stooges like Kissinger have been trying to undo the nation state system. Because as long as there's a nation state, there's a power that we have to destroy we can defend ourselves, but we can offensively also act against the oligarchy, making positive policies for both our domestic program, but also for our neighborhood, our future with our neighboring countries. So we can do all of these things. And I'm just hoping that people are able to. I don't see enough of a coherence in. I see what people don't want as far as the Great Reset, and we should be having marches against the Great Reset, not just blame. There's marches all over the world about I want to blame Israel for everything, or I want to blame Hamas and Palestinian terrorists for everything. People who know better are falling into these dichotomized traps that are created for them to fall into a narrative. Are you with us or with the enemy? And both sides have different versions of the same thing that didn't do us any favors after 9/11. And so I think if we could just focus on the real issue that there is a depopulation agenda, there is an agenda to undo the American and every nation's sovereignty under a new global collectivist system that would make it more easy to create scarcity, to contract the world population. Just hold those basic facts in mind, and then look at, well, what do we need to do? We need to, the banking system is going to blow up. That's going to set in a chain reaction that will create total chaos, at which point a lot of the freedom that we currently have to use these platforms is going to go away. So we have a window of opportunity. Certain things have worked in the past. The oligarchy is afraid of them. We should do more of what the oligarchy is afraid of. If that means, I mentioned a few things. There's other things like that. Obviously, World War III is a serious one. There's all sorts of mutual security agreements that are signed on both sides that could be triggered, that could get out of hand. The oligarchy doesn't necessarily control all those outcomes. They've taken a genie out of the bottle. There's a bit of a gamble that they can control the wars that they're about to unleash and then put the genie back in the bottle. Sometimes they've been able to do it. Now we have nuclear bombs all over the world. Not the same formula that worked for thousands of years. It's a different ballgame. And I think that's why I get a little perverse joy watching some of the signs of intersecting conflict amongst various factions within the oligarchy. There's not a coherence of consensus amongst the oligarchical class today about what exactly should be done. I'm seeing a lot of infighting, signs of infighting. I'm not there for the secret club meetings, but you could see it, right? So I get some pleasure in a certain sense in that, and I do get a certain amount of, and I'll end it here. I know I'm rambling, but I do get a certain amount of melancholy is not the right word, but I do get a certain amount of hope by the fact that I do see a fight against very powerful evil operations within Eurasian countries, especially that have. I'm convinced. I mean, people could write to me and tell me why I'm wrong, but I'm pretty persuaded that I see an authentic fight going on that's not simply controlled opposition against the depopulation death cultists. That is something we could work with if we wanted to, and I think it would be preferable if we were trying to do things that involved collaborating with those who were also fighting the death cult, using the power of the nation state to do that, instead of just trying to find oversimplistic blames that make us happy with whatever prejudice we might otherwise have that we didn't examine, that reduces our efficiency at defending our families. I'll stop it there, I think, because I could ramble on and I could.
No, it's great, and I was gonna say that we should do an episode just on the infighting of the oligarchies, right? And looking at, and sure. That's a great topic. But I've got a little bit of a hard cutoff, so otherwise we could just keep going. Which we'll have to do this again. I want to bring up your main website, CanadianPatriot.org. Is this the best place people can follow you and what you're doing, Matt?
Yeah, that's a great spot. And our new episode one of an 8-part documentary series on the hidden hand behind UFOs, lifting the veil, going back to ancient cult structures of ancient pagan Rome, Babylon. It plays a big role in that first episode. So that's going to be a new series. A lot of videos are there. Our books are there. My wife and I co-manage the site. We both are authors of many books, and you can find them all over that website. And we also have risingtidefoundation.net as a little bit more of a cultural, educational website. So that's another one people could play around with.
Well, Matt, as our first show together, it was a lot of fun. I can't wait to have more of these discussions and just dive in. So thanks again for coming on. Thank you for what you're doing, and I look forward to next time.
Me too. All right, it's a pleasure. Okay, take care.